Change and Plan, like the A-Team, love it when a plan comes together, is going to be Marc Morano. He's going to speak next. He serves as CFACT's Director of Communications, runs the Climate Depot News and Information website, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. I've known Marc for quite a number of years. I actually met him, and this would be no surprise to those of you who know, well, Marc, myself, James Taylor, and others, is smoking cigars. I met him at a lot of these UN conferences as we flew around the world. I never saw him in Washington, though he was working in Washington at the time very often. It would always be in some far-off place in Kenya or Indonesia or whatever. But I got to like the guy, you know. I'm a little bit older than him, but we're roughly the same age, and we bonded as pretty good friends. And when you're at these conferences, there's not a whole lot of climate, skeptics or realists at them. So you seek each other out, had the cigar thing in common, became good friends, and when circumstances presented themselves, of course, I had to hire the guy. Anyway, Marc began he's a Virginia native. He went to George Mason University, and after doing some political work, began his career being Rush Limbaugh's man in Washington. Now, how many of you remember Rush Limbaugh's original show when he was on television? Anybody? Yeah. Well, Marc was that guy, if you remember that at all, who would always be in some sort of disguise. He would never show his face, kind of like Home Improvement, the guy with his, you'd just see his eyes, he'd put on a hat, and he would interview a lot of liberals who didn't know what he looked like, and he'd catch them off guard, and Rush loved it and would always put him on, his little segment. It was very humorous, and one of the highlights of Rush's TV show, short-lived though it was. After that, he was picked up a lot for his filming by American Investigator and did some great series, one in particular on the rainforest, which got my attention. As watching it was just a fantastic takedown of some of the false claims that were made about rainforest loss, some that Patrick Moore brought up here, saying that we're going to lose all the forests in a decade or so. I used that in order to invite him to speak to our collegians. And again, it was an excuse for more cigars. He went from there to a service called CNS News, and he did some coverage for Brent Bozell's outfit, and then was picked up by Senator Inhofe and worked for the Environment and Public Works Committee for a number of years, really taking over that website. He was a powerful force in getting out climate realist information for quite a number of years, and really stoked the left, and they were infuriated because this was coming out on official government, website information that was actually just going against the face of everything Al Gore was saying, and he was powerful, just a powerful tool in that until 2006. If you remember that election, that was the one when the Democrats pretty much cleaned house, and one of their first priorities in taking over that particular committee was to shut Marc up. And it took him a couple years, but when Marc came to me, he was kind of panicked and saying, "Craig, they're going to shut me up. Can I come work for CFACT?" And I said, "Well, let's see if we can scrounge up the money." We did, and he came and he started as our director of communications. And a lot of people were wondering if he stepped down from the Senate Environment and Energy Committee or Public Works Committee, if he would ever be heard from again. But boy, has he been heard from since. That's far from being something that might cripple your career. He took off. Marc, starting at that time, wound up getting interviewed on pretty much every major network you could imagine. In fact, the journal Nature did a study and looked at the most quoted source. And they did this, of course, to attack skeptics. Who do they need to shut up? And they were looking at who's the one that's getting the information out there the most that is contrary to the UN IPCC narrative. And it was Marc Morano. At the time they did the study, he had been quoted some 4,171 times by media mentions. And we're not just talking conservative, but also liberal media mentions. The next closest one was Senator Inhofe at 2,628 times. So he pretty much, that's significantly higher than even number two. So he's been a one-man wrecking crew on that. He's been called the godfather of climate denial. I think it was Rolling Stone magazine that put that out. He's published 3 books. One's called The Politically Incorrect Guide to Climate Change, Green Fraud, and his most recent one, The Great Reset. He's also done 2 movies with us. If you guys have ever seen it, Climate Hustle and Climate Hustle 2. Always like to brag, that was the #1 movie in America for one night back in 2016. Stephen Hayward calls Morano the Pete Rose and Hank Aaron of the climate contrarians. If you turn on Fox News, he's on pretty much every week. It could be Tucker one week, could be Jesse Waters the next week, could be Fox and Friends, but he's also on a lot of other networks, often maligned by the mainstream media, but a great guy, a great husband and father to his wife Jennifer, and has a couple of his daughters here today, and a great friend. So I welcome to the stage Marc Morano, who will be talking, I guess, about the Great Reset, right? Thank you.
All right. Thank you for that introduction, and thank the Heartland Institute for this opportunity. I'm going to talk Great Reset today. You know, when James and Jim asked me, they said, Mark, do you believe in free speech? And I said, absolutely. I think it's one of the fundamental bedrocks of our society. And they said, well, that's good, because you're giving a free speech in Orlando. So here I am. Great Reset. Now, I spoke this morning at a panel, but I just want to say that in March 2020, our entire climate energy debate changed, probably forever within our lifetime. It accelerated a lot of trends. What happened in March of 2020 essentially was the bypassing of democracy for COVID regulations. And the left and the climate activists were very jealous at first, and then later they're like, we got to do the same thing. And this had happened in Obama. They had the executive orders with all their climate stuff, and they were trying to, because he failed to get it through Congress. But they were lusting after the idea of just declaring an emergency and then doing whatever you wanted. Very similar to one-party rule China. That's my book, The Great Reset. And yes, there is a book, Justin with the Heartland Institute, their book with Glenn Beck, and we also have one, a couple other ones. But my book came out in September of this year, past year, and I go through the whole concept of the Great Reset, World Economic Forum. And I'm going to explain today how this is a multi-pronged attack. This was decades of trends that led to this, and our whole climate debate now is no longer in the Democratic realm. At least they're pushing it to keep it out of the Democratic realm. This is Klaus Schwab, you know him. The pandemic is a rare, narrow window of opportunity to reset our world. He said this in June of 2020, 2 months after COVID lockdowns hit. Every country must participate, you will be transformed. A reset of capitalism. This is coming from the Davos World Economic Forum. These are the people who came up with stakeholder capitalism. You don't evaluate your business on whether it's profitable, you get a return on your money. It's all about whether you basically meet woke principles of equity, diversity, inclusion, climate, environmental goals. Their slogan became, you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. This is right off their video. They later pulled this video, and many people, including Ezra Levant and others, saved the video on archive. They gave away too much of their game a few years before. Whatever you want will be delivered by drone. Now, this is long before COVID, so you get the idea. There's stay-at-home kind of stuff here. Other stuff will be delivered. They even go so far as to describe you won't even own appliances. You'll rent one. If you need a blender, you hit up a little app, and then one gets delivered within minutes, and then you're finished with it. You come back, a drone will take it away. They have this arrogance of this vision of this great reset where bureaucracy is going to just be incredibly efficient. They predict 1 billion people will die of climate change, or displaced. Meat, this is about meat, it's important. It's an occasional treat, not a staple, for the good of the environment and our health, because that's one of the things they're doing. So what I'm going to talk about today is very simple. These are the intentional collapse of modern society. They're collapsing our free speech rights and currency, along with that central bank digital currency, which I'll talk a little bit about. Our current energy system, which you know all about, is being intentionally collapsed for this net zero utopian vision. Our transportation system is being collapsed. And make no mistake, a mandate for electric cars and banning of gas-powered cars creates car shortages. That's all it can do. A la Cuba, a la East Germany with the old crappy East German Trabant, where you had to be on waiting lists for years. One government-approved car was the Trabant, and that's where it's going to be here with that. So we're going to be like a Mecca with Cuba if we allow this to go through. And the secondary phrase here is, this will happen if we allow it. We can't allow it. Our ability to own home and property intentionally collapsed. Our high-yield agriculture, which I think Patrick Moore and some others are going to be talking about, is being intentionally collapsed to create man-made food shortages. And we'll talk about that, with what's going on in the Netherlands. So in I believe this was 1919, the Russian Revolution is going on. The slogan for Vladimir Lenin doing the Tsar against the Tsarist Russia was, the worse the better, worse is better. Now, I've done a lot of interviews in the Great Reset, and they're like, oh, that's just not going to happen. They'll never be able to achieve that vision. And I'm like, it's not really about achieving their utopian vision, whether it's on energy or the ideal number of people. It's about creating a massive amount of chaos, which would then put them in charge of this chaos. We're already seeing calls to nationalize the energy industry because the free market failed to manage energy. Every time there's a blackout, more calls to nationalize it. Once they create a food shortage, we've been warned by Al Gore and the United Nations and people like James Hansen, climate will cause great food disruption. No, the climate policies will cause great food disruption. And so once their policies cause this disruption, the intentional collapse, then they get even more power and do more of the same policies. And that, make no mistake, is how they're going to get us, this chaos and shortages, get you more likely to be open to eating insects as a protein source, more likely to be eating Bill Gates' lab-grown meat, which is different than the Impossible Burger, not the vegetable. I'm talking about lab-grown meat, stem cells from a cow or a calf, grown in a steel vat, cultivated for a few months, and then literally printed up on a 3D printer. World Economic Forum loves that idea. Hey, what's for dinner, honey? Oh, I'm making a steak, one of those synthetic steaks. It'll be ready in about 20 minutes. It prints up 3 kilograms a minute or something. This is what they're literally talking about. They don't want to have us, the old system. So this is a 1932 book. This is FDR's kitchen cabinet, Stuart Chase, an economist. And his actual line in the book at the end of the 1932 book is, why should the Soviets have all the fun remaking the world? Now remember, this was during the time New York Times was praising Stalin's land reforms in Russia, his 5-year plans, the agricultural revolution. Roosevelt's cabinet got caught up in this. When he means by have all the fun, he means this vision of this ruling class elite being able to manage and plan and micromanage every aspect of your life, the administrative state. That's fun for these guys. And as I mentioned this morning, every era of history, the ruling class has tried to invent ways in which to make the rest of us lose our freedom, and they want to make us happy that we're losing our freedom. It's for our own good. We're protecting you from whether it's even terrorism or the climate or the environment or food shortages or this chaos. We'll protect you. You just have to give up your freedom. And COVID was the exact example of that. But in this book, in Roosevelt's kitchen cabinet, he envisioned, this is incredible, control of banking, credit by the government, control of energy sources, hydroelectric, coal, petroleum, control of transportation, railway, highway, airway, control of agricultural production, state control of communication and propaganda, their phrase. What's amazing about this, they didn't achieve that all then, but this has been their goal. So they wait, it's lie in waiting. They wait for that crisis to push this. So what's happened, I think, since March of 2020 and why everything's changed just in terms of politically for us, the once free West is copying China's one-party rule. This is the World Health Organization sent a sham investigative committee in January, February of 2020. Go see what's going on in China. At the time, China was locking down. They had the hazmat suits. They were telling people that people were dropping dead in the streets, if you believe the videos, and they were doing a complete lockdown. Well, Anthony Fauci got on board, Neil Ferguson, and the WHO, World Health Organization, said copy China. Italy did it, and then it came to the United States and globally, and we all locked down. Neil Ferguson said if China had not done the lockdown, the year would have been different. So this was done like, thank God for China. That's their mentality. So the once free West for years has lusted after this one-party Chinese-style rule. This is Tom Friedman on the pages of the New York Times. This wasn't like, oh, he said it in a blog or he was in an interview. One-party autocracy certainly has its drawbacks, but it's led by a reasonably enlightened group of people, as China is today. Don't you know they support climate change? It can also have great advantages. The one party can impose the politically difficult but critically important policies needed to move a society forward. This is our ruling class, pages in the New York Times praising China's one-party rule. United Nations climate chief, Cristina Figueres, former chief, she lamented U.S. democracy as detrimental in the war on global warming and lauded one-party China for, quote, doing it right on climate. Apple CEO Tim Cook, a few years ago, claimed China aligns completely with Apple's values. I mean, who could not look at China and just think, wow, they're so impressive, they're aligned with all of my values. Cook defended the Communist Chinese Party as very fixated on doing the right things to avert climate change. So all you with an iPhone, ditch it. Of course, Google phones and Androids probably know better, but anyway, the point is, this is the corporate government collusion. Justin Trudeau, 2013, there's a level of admiration I have for China because their basic dictatorship is allowing them to turn their economy around on a dime. Wow, good work, China. German economic professor Anthony Mueller, the lockdown and the consequences have brought a foretaste, a permanent state of fear, strict behavioral control, job loss, growing dependence on the state. So remember, that chaos that Vladimir Lenin used against Tsarist Russia, the more chaos you have, the more people dependent. We saw this when I was in the U.S. Senate. They would pass these, try to do cap and trade, and as a compensation to raise energy bills, the government would then come in and subsidize the poor. Well, that's a win-win. You get to have your Democratic donors get all the wind and solar and subsidies and make energy expensive. At the same time, you get more voters dependent on the government to pay their electric bill, which means you have more voters to guarantee your re-election, more people dependent on you. Lockdowns in this situation were very similar to, I would call it, a climate solutions on steroids, because for years they talked about planned recessions at these global climate summits. What was a lockdown except a massive government-induced recession? And they didn't work. In terms of COVID, renowned Stanford epidemiologist John Ioannidis, there was a clash between two schools of thought, authoritarian public health versus science, and science lost. And I think you could change the words there for authoritarian climate science versus science, and science lost for the climate debate as well. Klaus Schwab is you say what you will about him, he's a master strategist. He says, we penetrate the cabinets, like an old Bond villain that you'd see. And he brags about people like Justin Trudeau, half of his cabinets throughout Europe. It's amazing how the young leadership program that he's indoctrinated, much the same way Al Gore has his climate apostles that he pushes forward. The Great Reset, these are some of the cabinet members and officials and people tied with the Great Reset. We penetrate the cabinets around the world. You can watch the video of that. And when they say follow the science, this is really what it's about. The science, and you all know that in this room, the politics leads the science. So if you hear the science with a trademark next to it, it's anything but the science. Thomas Sowell, I think, put the best summation. Experts are called in not to provide factual information or analysis, but by officials to give political cover for decisions already made. So whenever you hear about, well, the experts say, it's because politically that's what they decided the experts were going to say, not because the science of any kind showed it. Otherwise, you wouldn't end up with kids in a green bubble for band practice during COVID because this was public health following the science. This actually happened. That was in Oregon. Governor Newsom, well, let me make sure I didn't miss anything. Yeah, Governor Newsom, lockdowns made billionaires richer. He actually was asked about this, and he said, how can you say we're hurting the California economy? We have all these new billionaires. We're leading the world in the creation of new billionaires. Our economy is doing great in California. Well, how can you criticize? We all want to be prosperous, right? How can you criticize Newsom for that? Well, here's the problem. During these lockdowns, workers lost $3.7 trillion in earnings, with the biggest thing happening to young people, women, and minorities, actually, too. And guess how many, and billionaires made about the same exact amount. The pandemic created a new billionaire every 30 hours. So it was the largest transfer of wealth from poor middle class to the wealthy. All the mom and pop restaurants crushed, but hey, Amazon was open. Government unelected bureaucrats without a vote of parliament, Congress, city hall, town council, churches closed, weddings, funerals canceled, backyard barbecues. You could get rewards if you snitched on your neighbor. They could have their utilities cut off if you have too many people in your house. Vaccine mandates, mask mandates, but the big corporations stayed open. Walmart was open, Amazon boomed, big tech boomed, Zoom, all the small businesses, and this was always, it's harder to control the small businesses. So in terms of waiting for that moment, that crisis, don't let it go to waste, that's why lockdowns were so important to this agenda. Also, Anthony Fauci, hey, his net worth soared 12.6 million during this lockdown. And everyone making the decisions to lock down and keep these lockdowns, none of their jobs were dependent, whether it was public health official, politicians, or the big media that supported it, they were never going to be affected by these lockdowns. They all had jobs. In Australia, I don't know, Ian Plimer was up here, but Australia seemed to have lost its mind during the pandemic, probably the most authoritarian response next to China, and Canada would be a close second with Australia, and then maybe New Zealand after that. But they had authorized, under emergency powers, break into any land, structure, vehicle, whatever force, direct or prohibit movement of people, put people in quarantine. They had quarantine camps set up. They had track and trace apps. You go to a grocery store, 6 hours later, you get an alert. You were near someone who later tested positive. You might be eligible to go into a forced quarantine camp. Well, guess who? But Bill Gates, the number 2 funder of the World Health Organization, thinks the whole world should emulate. He can't say China because it's a little too far. We should do exactly what Australia did. And why do we care what Bill Gates thinks? Because this man, tens of millions of dollars to the media, buys his own media, and most importantly, he is the number 2 donor to the World Health Organization, which is seeking a pandemic treaty now. Bill Gates, next to the United States government, owns the World Health Organization. And they're also beholden to China, the World Health Organization. One of the best things Donald Trump did was withdraw funding and support from the United to the World Health Organization. If you think the UN is bad, you haven't looked at much into the World Health Organization. Much, much worse. So part of the thing they play is the language. This is Merriam-Webster Dictionary. They redefine the word anti-vax not to be you're against vaccines, but if you were against vaccine mandates. This was a shocking thing. So now anyone who didn't get their 6th booster was an anti-vaxxer, and that's the war language that was a corporate government collusion. Justin Trudeau said, how do we tolerate these people? It turned into an incredible demonization. We learned all this. My talk this morning is what I learned, everything I learned in the climate debate applied to COVID. I'd already understood it. And this was one of them, the demonization and attack of climate skeptics. Well, he went after unvaccinated and said, how do we tolerate these people? In a very, I don't want to be accused of Godwin's law, so I'll say a 1930s Germany way there. No one knows what I'm referring to. Bill Maher, who now is, I'm willing to welcome Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Naomi Wolf, Bill Maher, Russell Brand, Jimmy Dore. We have to build a new coalition. It's not left-right anymore. It's freedom versus tyranny. Bill Maher said of Justin Trudeau, I thought he was a cool guy. And then I read what he said about how do we tolerate the unvaccinated. It's like, tolerate? Now you sound like Hitler. And he said, this is HBO's Bill Maher, corporate America. So the idea of a permanent climate crisis, they already did this with COVID. We need a permanent pandemic because of the power. Scottish government seeks to make government powers permanent. Jane Fonda said COVID was God's gift to the left because it basically gave them everything they wanted without the messiness of democracy. Slovenia, drivers must present COVID certificates to refuel their cars. You see what's happening here. This was what happened. Your spending, and this is now central bank digital currency, this is the UK Telegraph. Your spending is now restricted to what the government deems sensible. This past year, 2022, Joe Biden issued America's first central bank digital currency executive order. We're now moving toward this sort of cashless society. And look at how frightening this is. Digital cash could be programmed to ensure it's only spent on essentials or that which an employee or government deems to be sensible. So you want to use your own money to buy meat, tobacco, alcohol, fuel up gas, or keep your thermostat a few degrees cooler. That's not sensible. That's not a sensible expense to the government. This is what's coming down, and this is the ultimate corporate government. When Justin Trudeau didn't like the trucker protest, he literally picked up the phone, First of all, he declared the Emergencies Act, which made them into domestic terrorists. He picks up the phone, calls the bankers, and says, I want you to cut off access to all these truckers, their own money. This wasn't like, we'll cut off access to services. The truckers couldn't access their own money that was in these banks. And then if you made a donut or coffee for them, you would have access to your money cut off as well. He also had their insurance canceled for boot. That is corporate government collusion. We used to call it fascism. This is Donald Trump's national security advisor, Flynn, Chase Bank, after careful consideration. Because of his relationship with Donald Trump, they didn't like it. They considered an advisor to Donald Trump a, quote, reputational risk to Chase Bank. And they canceled him. Now, there was a huge outcry, and they later came back on. But we've seen similar stuff with Airbnb. If they don't like your politics, they take it away. We saw it with the GoFundMe sites. If the ruling elites don't like the cause, they take the money, and they were going to give it to someone else, and then they ended up being forced to refund it. But we're not far from the day where you're going to have your card decline. I think I'll talk about it a little bit here about the MasterCard and the United Nations teaming up to have the carbon footprint cards, and it cuts off your spending when you hit your max. Big tech censorship is government censorship. We saw Anthony Fauci and the head of the NIH colluding to stop the Barrington Declaration. We've seen the United Nations claim they own the science on climate change. We saw the Biden administration providing lists of names, and they're all shut down. It's not like, oh, these are private companies, they can do what they want. This is absolute government farming out its censorship in violation of our First Amendment. Flicking the kill, governments embrace internet shutdowns as a form of control. In these pandemic planning sessions, Event 201, Rockefeller, they talked openly, and the preceding ones right before COVID hit, they had these simulated events with actors and movies stuff. They talked about misinformation and shutting down the global internet, global communication to prevent misinformation. So they're going after your speech. This is New Zealand Prime Minister actually said, we, the government, will continue to be your single source of truth during COVID. Trust the government. Of course, Anthony Fauci, I am the science. The UN declares we own the science and the world should know it. And of course, Google partnered with them to make sure that results from the Heartland Institute or anyone else, Anthony Watts or Climate Depot, would be suppressed. This is how they do it. Love this quote from John Kennedy. This was during the founding of Voice of America. We should not be afraid to entrust people with unpleasant facts, foreign ideas, competitive values. A nation afraid to let people judge the truth in falsehood in an open market is a nation afraid of its people. They are terrified of us. And the idea, the key line in this is judge the truth in falsehood. That's what they don't think we can do. That's what the whole world of fact-checking. In fact, CFACT is being, our website, we're being investigated for a possible fact-check, these ratings groups that come out. COVID climate reset. The next crisis is already waiting for us around the corner. It is the climate crisis, Klaus Schwab. So Richard Lindzen, who's here, I use this in my book for my key climate chapter. I love this quote. It's from Richard Lindzen in 2009. I don't know if you remember saying it, but it's hard to imagine a better leverage point than CO2 to assume control over a society. If you gain control, you, so to speak, control everything. Well, they imagined it. A fear of a virus that was weaponizing our breath became actually even more powerful than carbon dioxide, and they were able to achieve everything they wanted. It called a flu d'etat. Overnight, we basically became part of the Green New Deal. Everything that ever wanted was implemented immediately. A stop of air travel, school promises of free health care, status quo, ability of people to sit at home without working, receive a paycheck. This was the fantasy that they'd had. World Health Organization, climate is the greatest challenge. This was done a year and a half before COVID hit, so they're set. Remember, climate cannot stand on its own anymore. I do not believe. I believe it's going to be climate, COVID merged together. I'll explain here in a second. Climate lockdowns, I won't spend too much time here, but it is interesting. The origin of the phrase lockdown is a prison term. It's meant to control the movement of inmates. This is interesting. Eva de Boer, UN Chief Climate Advisor, 2013, said the only way we can achieve these temperature goals is to shut down the whole economy. Well, gee, that's 7 years before we actually did shut down the whole economy. November 2019, a few months before we were verifying COVID and before the hysteria hit, the UN demanded, this is from the UN website, 7% yearly cut in CO2 just 6 months before COVID lockdowns began. 7% in November 2019. Follow me. By December 2020, 1 year later, guess what? World carbon dioxide emissions fell 7% in 2020. Now, do you want to bet against the UN? They called it, it happened, and they got exactly what they wanted. I was impressed. I don't know how they did it, but that was eerie. I was searching this, and I came across this. They called 7%, and then it happened. 2021 demand. Continued lockdown-like emissions. Actual headline, UK Guardian, global lockdown needed every 2 years, needed to meet Paris goals. There you go. It's all we got to do. Just have lockdowns every 2 years, and we can finally solve global warming. Why can't people just go along with it? COVID lockdown helps save the planet. It's not only good for the virus, but it's good for the planet. How could you lockdown deniers? So here's what's funny. They'll say, oh, this is a conspiracy. At the last Heartland Conference, we had the UK reporter here. Climate lockdown is a conspiracy. A Bill Gates, George Soros-funded professor in Europe, Mariana Mazzucato, coined the term climate lockdowns. She said the world may need to resort to lockdowns again, this time to tackle a climate emergency. So they're using it. Their experts that they fund are using that. Under a climate lockdown, limit private vehicle use, ban consumption of red meat, impose extreme energy saving. So remember, COVID was not wasted. These emergency powers immediately pressure on Biden to declare a national climate emergency. From Sanders, Ocasio-Cortez, many Democrats in the Senate, climate activists, Scientific American, we're living in a climate emergency, we're going to say so. Here's the key. You go back, and I mentioned this earlier, but the fall of the Roman Republic, through the Middle Ages, and throughout history, the Third Reich, the greatest abuses of human rights occurred during these emergency powers. Politicians love and abuse them. This is a BBC analysis about these emergency power abuse. The similarities between 9/11 and the abuse of emergency powers. What happened during 9/11 were all terrorists. The 2001 Patriot Act, which was sort of derivative from the 9/11 terrorist emergency power, which we're still living under that emergency act, has not gone away, allowed domestic surveillance of our citizens. And this is why one of the reasons during the school board, angry parents at all these school board meetings, they were declared domestic terrorists by the Biden administration. We're still living in the 9/11 climate terrorism emergency, and it just keeps getting extended. It's bipartisan. COVID emergency powers were ineffective. They found out that the response bottom 7 of the surveyed measures, so they don't even work. Interestingly enough, and according to this analysis, even when you declare a natural disaster, use emergency powers for natural disasters and declare a disaster area, they don't really help anything with the disasters. The body count, controlling for disaster, it doesn't really matter. So all this political pressure, we got to declare a disaster area, it doesn't actually help the area, according to the BBC analysis. Biden could declare a climate emergency as soon as this week. This was last summer, and there's now talk for him renewing that in his final term in office. Estimated to give him 130 different powers. And again, this is what they're looking for. They don't need Congress, don't need no stinking democracy. This is the CO2 monitoring card I mentioned, shuts you off when you hit your carbon max, corporate government collusion, or in this case it would be corporate international organization with the UN collusion and the World Economic Forum. The International Energy Agency went kind of weird. I always thought they were more of a normal organization when I was in the Senate. They gave a lot of good data. They become very woke, for lack of a better word, which is now considered a racist term, by the way, if you say woke, according to Soledad O'Brien of CNN. Anyone who uses the word woke is now equivalent of using a racist term. But their 2001 International Energy Agency report urged behavioral changes to fight climate, a shift away from private car use, upper speed limit, thermostat control, limits on your hot water. Keep in mind, this isn't a Greenpeace blog or Sierra Club. This is the International Energy Agency report. UK-funded report, absolute zero. Same language, urged climate lock to stop flying, no new roads, airport closures, stop eating beef, stop doing anything that causes emissions. The last one is chilling, whereas Greg Wrightstone will appreciate this. Regulate carbon dioxide similar to asbestos. Now, we inhale oxygen, we exhale carbon dioxide. So can you imagine we're going to need hazmat suits for everyone in this room if you get near anyone? This was in their report. I read the transcript. This was debated in the UK government, this report. And what was sad was that all of the ones that were supposed to be on our side fighting against this, they were terrified to challenge any of the premises. They were sort of the, oh, not so fast, me too, I won't challenge it. Very disappointed. Journal Nature, COVID lockdowns key to begin personal carbon allowances. Restrictions on individuals unthinkable have us more prepared to accept tracking and limitation. British Medical Journal calls for meat dairy price hikes. substantially fewer car journeys, 80% drop in meat consumption. You see where this is going? These are major medical journals now. We're not talking, again, we're not talking about, I found some obscure quote from George Monbiot. No, this is the actual power centers of our science, government, corporate, academia. 230 medical journals declared COVID-19 response the template for climate. Well, what does that mean? No democracy, emergency powers, imposing, doing whatever you want, a la China. It's very clear about what they're doing. Freedom of movement. Electric vehicles won't save us. We need to get rid of cars completely. You'll go nowhere and be happy. Let's update that. This just happened last month. Biden administration new strategy to address climate. Don't leave your house. They're looking for more remote work, virtual interactions. Does that sound like a world you want to live in? This is where they're headed with it. Scottish government also just declared era of unconstrained growth in car use is over. Pete Buttigieg, every transportation decision is a 21st century, is a climate decision in the 21st century. Every transportation decision is a climate decision. Owning a car, outdated 20th century thinking. Make no mistake, they're not coming after gas-powered cars. They're coming after cars, including electric cars. They're also coming after your home. Houses pose more danger to climate than vehicles. Rethinking home ownership. This is a professor, UCLA Urban Planning. Given the scope of the climate crisis, we need another kind, away from our ideologies of ownership. How many of you here are guilty of any kind of ideology of ownership? Ideology's bad, bad. They want you to go toward a more collective, healthy, and just city. Owning something creates social injustice. This is according to the United Nations Conference on Human Settlements, Vancouver. Land cannot be treated as an ordinary asset. Its private land ownership is a principal instrument of accumulation and concentration of wealth, therefore contributes to social injustice. So basically, if you own land, that's a racist act. You'll own nothing and be happy. Don't have to worry about it because Bill Gates is buying it up. Bill Gates, they were worried about China, Bill Gates, who's going to own the most farmland. I'm happy to report that a homegrown American, Bill Gates, has stuffed China and is now the single largest farmland owner. But here's the question. Do you want Bill Gates? Who would you rather be America's largest single farmland owner, Bill Gates or China? I'm not going to, I have to think about it. It's like Jack Benny. I'm thinking. It's a hard one to answer. Bill Gates, according to NBC News, America's biggest farmland owner, and here's what I like, NBC News reports, he's not the one in overalls. He's not the one on the tractor doing the farming. He's the landlord. Oh, really? For a second there, I was thinking this was Green Acres and Bill and Melinda were out there and Mr. Haney was trying to sell him a rusty old tractor, but no. Why does Bill Gates want to own this farmland? Why does he want sway in agricultural policy? His whole goal is lab-grown synthetic meat, investing billions of dollars grown in the steel vats that's going to replace meat. He doesn't want anyone in the developing world to eat actual livestock-made meat. He wants you to eat his lab-grown stuff. Great Diet Reset, this is what I was telling you about, 6 kilograms of meat an hour. They brag the machine can print up to this fake meat, this synthetic meat. World Economic Forum really wants you to eat insects, good grub. Drink up, cockroach milk is the protein drink you didn't know you've been missing. And here's my favorite, and I think David Gates is going to be talking about nitrous oxide, but here's the gist. Your urine, your pee, is now a dangerous warming agent. And how come you say, it's in the Scientific American, it's a peer-reviewed study in the Journal of Frontier in Ecology. Eating too much protein makes pee a pollutant problem. Pee can contribute to global warming. So there you go. So we need to stop peeing, you need to stop exhaling. It's very simple steps we can take if you care. What do I have, doctor? Climate change. Official doctor in Canada diagnosed a patient as suffering, had heat stroke. And of course, they also want to add climate as a cause of death on death certificates. You see where this is going. Nightly death toll counts. Harvard School of Public Health links COVID and climate. The root cause of climate increases pandemics. We need to take action to prevent the next pandemic. So this is it. If you don't support the Green New Deal, the UN Paris Agreement, you are a grandma killer because they're going to end up leading to unchecked climate change, which will then lead to more viruses. That's the new memo. And I'm not, again, this is the Harvard School of Public Health. I'm not pulling some obscure blogger and say, oh, look, this is what, no, I'm not doing this for entertainment. They're screaming this at us right now. Anyway, climate change will make pandemics more likely. This is journal Nature study. COVID-19 is awful. Climate could be worse. That's Bill Gates. The reality, of course, destroys the claim. I think this is from Anthony Watts. What's up with that? Yes, Anthony Watts. 100 years, then almost 99% drop in death when they're trying to scare you that climate's going to kill everyone. The big news right now, you'll see this next week and coming days, this new pandemic treaty. And this is the Washington Post. They call it a radical pandemic treaty. One Bill Gates-funded scientist, the WHO, will be able to declare a public health emergency, shut down globally. The Biden administration is trying to commit us to this treaty, makes the UN Paris Agreement look like child's play. This is really one of our biggest fights, to fight for freedom. Next up, your kids, is having a baby in 2021 pure environmental vandalism. How many people have engaged in environmental vandalism here? I'm good. Okay. If you're speechless, that's because climate change is the cause. Climate change is accelerating the loss of language and maybe common sense. I don't know. So keep calm and trust the experts. Which experts should you trust? The EPA chief. He was just at the Ohio train derailment. Trust the government. That was his message as he gingerly sipped that water, I noticed, in the lady's house. And by the way, train derailments, 2020, Greta Thunberg, blamed on climate change because of bad weather. So the New York Times, critical thinking leads to misinformation. Don't go down the rabbit hole of critical thinking. Now, I'm talking to you, Patrick Moore. I'm talking to you, Ian. Stop this critical thinking. This is getting in the way. It's not helping in the fight against misinformation. You must not do your own research when it comes to science. Why would you? Just trust the government. The government will be your single source of information. You've heard it over and over. Questioning authority had been too much of a good thing. It's killing people. Let me change it. You're all killing people because you're questioning it. Stop questioning. Let's let people live. And I love this, Slate magazine. It's time to give up on facts. What the hell? All right. Actually lay them down temporarily in favor of a more useful weapon, emotions. That's why Greta says, I want you to panic. Why? Because then you can't think logically and you'll go along with whatever crap they're pushing. Economist Milton Friedman said, free societies, the kind we've been lucky enough to experience for the last 150 years, are a rare exception in human history. And this next line is frightening. Most people, most of history, have lived in tyranny and misery. We can never forget that. We can't just assume that the American experiment's going to continue on when we've allowed all these threats to go unchecked up till now. So, the lowest level of politics was the greatest power against the whole COVID lockdown, led to the dropping of mask mandates in San Francisco, Washington, Baltimore, New York, Philadelphia, because angry parents changed an election in Virginia, almost toppled a governor. Democrats did focus groups, got terrified that their own base wanted it to end, and that's where they lifted this is according to the New York Times, lifted all the mask mandates and vax mandates in all the major cities. We need emergency power reform. We can argue all you want about persuasion, but we need to stop this, and this is from Competitive Enterprise Institute, we need to stop this cycle of declaring emergencies, and the problem is we're about to get a climate emergency declaration. There's also gun violence declaration, there's a misinformation and all these public health emergencies. So the Great Reset should be the Great Resist or the Great Reject. And that's how you should talk to your friends. And I just say this has been the time when conspiracy realities have outnumbered conspiracy theories. All of this will only happen if we allow it. So thank you very much, CFACT. Appreciate the opportunity.